Tony Bennett, President of EDGA. Great to see you here at Woburn. Tony, can you first of all give us an overview of EDGA and what you guys do?
Yeah, EDGA started in 2000, formed in Wiesbaden, and it's just an association of people that had an interest for golfers with disability. And so that's sort of how it started, and there was lots of people that were doing kind of different things, and they were kind of doing their own thing. And so when you try, almost like different churches.
Yes.
And when they're in their own church, they were fine, but then when you tried to bring them together, they were all playing with different rules. Some were playing with different handicaps, some were what they call bumping the ball, so in other words, nudging the ball on the fairway, preferred lies. Right. Some were playing different kinds of formats, and so it was really difficult to bring them all together, different countries. And so that's what EDGA was formed to try and do, and say, oh, okay, let's try and create some kind of level playing field.
Yeah.
And in some countries, you know, one disability was recognised, in other countries it wasn't. And these were all kind of different organisations with no commonality.
Yeah.
So that's what EDGA did. And so
you
we did that.
Everything out.
Yeah, not easy, but try to do it. Different languages, etc. And different cultures. So, yeah, they kind of bumbled along until 2013, and at that stage they had like 400 golfers that were competitive golfers, and it was all considered a bit sort of rehabilitation and medical, a bit kind of health,
right.
A health sport rather than being a sport. So it was about getting people back into society and getting them to play a little bit, and that's what it was mainly about.
Yeah.
And then, so as I say, 8 federations at that time. 4 disability associations, 430 golfers or whatever it was. Really no influence, no money. That was it. But it was doing its thing.
Yeah.
And then in 2014 we had a bit of a change of trajectory, and EDGA had a bit of a change of direction, and said, look, you know, we now need to make this a bit better. And so today, if you fast forward to where we are today, it's a tenfold increase in competitive players. We've got about 4,000 competitive players, probably around 30,000 disabled golfers that are playing.
Great.
39 national federations that are members. We advise 51 national federations.
Wow.
All the major organisations.
That's
such
huge.
as... Yeah, it is, yeah. It is R&A, we advise them for things like this event, DP World Tour for the G4D Tour events, USGA for their eligibility. So we do all that eligibility stuff. Some people that will listen maybe will remember that on their computer that they had a little sticker, a little square sticker, and it stuck on the computer and it said Inside Intel.
Yes.
And it didn't really matter what kind of computer you bought, you had this little sticker there, and it basically meant that if you bought a Hewlett-Packard machine or a Fujitsu machine, as long as you had the chip, it worked. If you didn't have the chip, it didn't work. And we're a bit like that in that this isn't possible really without the eligibility stuff that EDGA does, without some of the comm stuff that we do, without some of the advice that we give. Neither is the DP World Tour, I should say the G4D Tour by the DP World Tour. And many of the other things that happen. So yeah, that's kind of what we do. That's a short version.
Wow, well, it sounds like you're incredibly busy. I was going to ask what you do this week with the DP World Tour and the R&A who are running this event, but I kind of pretty much know, you know, you're integral and you're advising them.
Yeah, we started this, I don't remember now, probably 5 or 6 years ago, and we started the conversation with the R&A about, you've got a Women's Open, you've got the Open Championship, obviously, you've got a Women's Open, you've got a Seniors Open, you've got a Junior Open. So really you should be having something for golfers with disabilities. So you should be having a G4D Open. So that's kind of when the conversation started, and then COVID gets in the way.
Yeah.
But then it's a question of, well, you know, let's find the right type of golf course. So we before anybody really knew, we were looking at golf courses and saying, well, you know, what is the type of golf course we need? So you come here to Woburn, you've got 3 great golf courses. But the Duchess is ideal because of the length and because the fact, I think I'm right in saying we've got 27 bunkers on this golf course. And you go to a golf course where you've got 360 bunkers or something, it's much more difficult for players that have got mobility issues. And the team here have been incredible because they've now made all those slightly inaccessible bunkers accessible.
Brilliant.
So I don't know if you've seen or if you've had the opportunity to get out there, but if you can do, you really should have a look at some of those bunkers because they've made some kind of temporary ramps to go in there. We did that last year. I'll not say Woburn did it, we advised. But they figured out a way to be able to do it in a way that it can be done for this week.
Oh, that's excellent.
And then it can be taken away.
Yeah, that's so brilliant that you've got a golf club here who are working with you to be able to make it accessible to golfers with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, the members here, seemingly, from what I understand, the volunteers have been great. They love it. They've had, I don't know how many championships here, and yet they sort of consistently say, apparently, we hear, that this is one of the best ones that they do. They really feel like they're valued, and the players feel really engaged, obviously, in making sure that they go back to the members and say, thanks for having us here.
Yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity to play such a great golf course.
Oh, great
but of course,
stuff.
the R&A doing the event that they do, and they do it in the way that they do it. I mean, you just take one look out there and you see that that's a major championship. It's not it's not kind of this little back thing that happens for people with disability. This is a major championship. It's part of their fundamental core business now, that this is a championship that will stay there for years to come.
Oh, great stuff. Now, you have said, you've spoken about golf being integrated sport rather than an adaptive or parallel version. Can you explain that? I think you've touched on it.
Yeah, I think. Look, we play the mainstream sport, so it's an inclusive sport. So everybody can play. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you come from. They can play. The golf club doesn't know who's swinging it, but the golf industry does. And so the golf industry sometimes needs to take a look at itself and say, okay, are we stopping people playing the game? The game doesn't. The game, basically, you take a stick, hit a ball to a target. That's basically it. You can do it alone, you can do it with friends, but that means that we're playing a sport that anybody can play.
Yeah.
It's an inclusive sport because of that. Now, occasionally we'll play a modified inclusive sport, and the interesting part to this is that this week you've got people playing in an inclusive sport, so in other words, nothing's different. Exactly as you and I would play.
Great.
You've got some players that are playing a modified inclusive sport because, for example, the visually impaired players, they're allowed to have somebody behind them to line them up, which is a pretty good idea with visually impaired players to make sure that they're pointing in the right direction. So they've got a modification to the rule that allows them to do that. So
Got you.
then you've got other kinds of sports. So you've got parallel sports, in other words, parasport. So that is often a sport that's similar to the mainstream sport, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
So you might think of wheelchair rugby.
Yeah.
It's not rugby. It's a different version, but it is rugby, but it's not the same. It's a parallel version to it. Wheelchair tennis would be a similar thing. It's not tennis, but it's sort of the same thing. And then you've got what they would call an adaptive sport. So we now adapt the sport to be able for people with disability to be able to play. So in other words, you might think an adaptation might be, well, what we'll do is we'll make the hole bigger.
Right.
But we don't do that.
No.
So we don't play an adaptive sport. And we don't play a discrete sport, which is something that is just for people with disability and nobody else can take part in it. So we do play an inclusive sport.
Yeah.
And so the terminology around the world is a bit clunky.
Yeah.
Adaptive sports in the US, because in the US they play adaptive sport. That's what they call it.
Right.
And so when golf starts playing, they say, oh, but it's just an adaptive sport. But it's culturally specific, but it's descriptively poor.
Got you. Yes.
In Australia they play all abilities golf. But you and I, we've got different abilities, so we could say we've got all abilities, but I don't think either of us could play in this event.
Yeah.
So even though we've all got different abilities, doesn't necessarily mean you'd be eligible to play in this. So all abilities, again, is culturally specific, but descriptively poor.
I'm glad you're doing this and not me, because it's quite complicated, isn't it?
It's terminology.
It is terminology which we
messaging.
need to use, we need to understand, we need to learn about.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
great.
look, I don't think anybody cares here, to be honest. And the guys and the girls are great because look, if you say something that's slightly offbeat, if it comes from the head,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like I made a miscalculation. They're kind of all right with that.
Yeah.
I thought this was going to be the right thing. I made a mistake. They're okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a mistake from the heart where we're trying to do something wrong, then they're very unforgiving about that. So
Yeah.
terminology, if we say the wrong thing to somebody, then just put your hands up and you kind of apologise and say, oops, I'll
Yeah.
learn and I'll get it right next time.
Absolutely. I think you're doing an absolutely tremendous job. I just wonder how many different categories you have this week in this major championship.
Well, this week we have sports classes.
Right.
So, and we did it again last year. So the sports classes we have 9.
Yep.
So in no specific order, you have numbers. So you go 1 would be the most impaired, and then 2 would be less impaired, and 3 would be the least impaired.
Got you.
Okay? So in sitting classes we have 2, sitting 1 and sitting 2.
Yeah.
In standing we have standing 1, 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Visual impairments 1 and 2, and intellectual impairments 1 and 2. And the nice thing about those 9 sports classes is that they can all play the same golf course, they can all do the same thing, they all play in exactly the same way. We will end up with an overall champion, but we'll end up with 9 sports class winners.
That's why I love golf. It's so fantastic that everyone's included and everyone's playing the same sport, same golf course. I think you're doing a tremendous job. And how impressed are you with what's going on in the world of golf for players with disability?
Yeah, I think if you go back to our forefathers in 2000, look, the first Disability Association was 1932, and that was the Royal Society of One-Armed Golfers. I think it was called the Royal Society, and that was up in Glasgow.
Right.
And it was very unique. It was about one-armed golfers. You had to play with one arm, and that was it.
That was
and
the only
all the other
category.
people were kind of left to one side. Nothing much changed then until the 50s and the 60s. When we get to 2000, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So realistically, if we start thinking about the trajectory of G4D, as we call it simply, it's 25, 30 years old. We think about a game of golf, which depends who you listen to. If you listen to the Scots, it's 500 years. If you listen to the Dutch, it's 700. If you listen to the Chinese, it's 1,000 years old.
Yes.
So I think if we think of it in those terms, we've come an awful long way in that 30 years period. I think we've come an enormous amount of distance in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Because that's where the real progress has been made. And so organisations that perhaps were previously a little bit sat on the fence, not really sure, should we get involved in this, shouldn't we? Now they're sort of beating down the door to say we need to get involved in this space because we see what the benefit is for the overall sport.
And I love the fact you've got some fantastic role models. I've just spoken to Joachim Bjorkman, who's world champion, European champion, national champion. So having these guys, put on a pedestal is brilliant for the world to see them. And I said to him, if you can see it, you can be it, which is inspiring to so many, hopefully. Tell us about the film that you've made. It was out in Portugal.
We've made a few, but the first film that we made was a few years ago called Mulligan, and that film was a game changer. It was a game changer, second chance at it, and
so good.
That was a great piece of work that really brought disability into people's living rooms. The recent film that we did was from a players' development camp that we did. So I mentioned about the G4D tour previously. This is effectively the tour that runs alongside the DP World Tour for golfers with disability. We play 8 or 9 events of those a year. Funnily enough, only a couple of weeks ago we got back from our first ever excursion into the PGA Tour.
Yes.
So that was good.
Mike Brown,
he's won his last 2, so he's on a roll. I'm sure he'll be looking for the 3rd one this week.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think the beauty about that is that that's now become aspirational for a lot of players.
Yeah.
So now what we need to do is prepare those players. So we did a players development camp in Portugal in the beginning of January, and we had 12 players that came, and they all qualified from their position in the ranking or from being the leading females or the leading under 21 players. And they were a great group of people. The nice thing about that group is that many of those players had unseen disabilities.
Really?
Because clearly it's pretty obvious when you see somebody in a wheelchair or you see somebody perhaps with an amputation and you go, okay, I get it. I now understand why that person's disabled. I understand why they're playing here this week. But you'll see somebody tee it off the first tee tomorrow and you go, the natural reaction is, what's wrong with that person? Because you sometimes can't see it. And so therefore we need to make sure that players with unseen disabilities or invisible disabilities, if you like, we need to make sure that they're just as valued as everybody else. So that's important, and I think the sports class icons that you'll see around this week as well, which it gives a visual impression. It's kind of a stick man, for want of a better description,
Okay.
a stick person, not man or male or female, just a stick person.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a colour code: green, yellow, orange and red. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And then of course there's missing limbs. So you see this trunk, you see this head, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet. That's kind of, shall we say, the general golfer.
Yeah.
And then of course you've got somebody with an amputation, well maybe the bottom part of the leg's missing on the icon. So if that person's walking around with trousers on, just looks like they've got a limp, you don't know what it is, but you look at their icon and you know exactly what that person's got.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And it'll be the same for somebody with an intellectual disability. You might go, oh, what's wrong with that person? Oh yeah, but okay, we can see that there's got a band that's showing on their icon around the head, maybe it's yellow, and that would be intellectual 2, or maybe it's orange or red, that would be intellectual 1.
Great to have that visualisation.
It's
for
so
spectators,
simple.
for everybody to be able to see what's going on,
It
to
gets
understand.
Absolutely, it gets the conversation away from what's wrong to
Yes.
look how well they play.
Yeah.
And the conversation needs to change like that.
Yeah.
It has to go that quick. So we just look at the player, look at the icon and go, okay, great, got it.
What's happening with that
What
player?
a good shot that
Yeah,
was. Or,
yeah.
you see how that happened?
Yeah.
That's great.
Great.
As opposed to having these sort of questions all the time. And our eligibility team do an incredibly difficult job. They do it incredibly well. The volunteers, we've got doctors and physiotherapists around the world that are doing this to put players into the right categories. And it's always a movable feast, because as we now know more, we're able to nuance those sports classes a little bit tighter,
You're
a little bit
constantly
easier.
learning, aren't you?
Constantly.
Yeah, great. Tony, thanks so much for your time. I've learnt a lot. You can test me later. Great stuff. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.